They weren't just business partners. They were a dynasty. For nearly a century, the Ford and Firestone families shared more than just factories. They shared life, weddings, vacations, and a trust that seemed forged in steel and rubber. A brotherhood that built America. But in 2001, the asphalt claimed the price of that union. Where there was fraternity, twisted metal emerged. Where there was loyalty, only the silence of investigations and the cry for accountability remained. Two empires, face to face, watching a century of history disintegrate at high speed. What happens when the failure isn't just a part, but an entire system? Was it a failure of engineering or a failure of character? Welcome, my son. Welcome to the machine. In 2001, two of the largest names in the American automotive industry began accusing each other publicly for highway deaths, breaking a bond of nearly 100 years of partnership. Ford-Firestone, a relationship that began in the early 20th century between Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone, a personal and industrial alliance. By the late 1990s, accident reports began to accumulate. At highway speeds, the tread separated from the tire. The vehicle lost stability. In numerous cases, rollovers occurred. The model most associated with the accidents was the Ford Explorer. The tires involved were, in large part, manufactured by Firestone. In 2000, more than 6.5 million tires were recalled for replacement in the United States. More than 200 deaths were associated with the accidents, according to investigations at the time. Congressional hearings were held. Executives were questioned under oath. The conflict ceased to be technical. It became institutional. The question was not only why the tire failed, it was whether the recommended tire pressure on the vehicle amplified the risk. It was who identified the pattern. It was when it was recognized, and why. Two industrial giants who shared a 100-year history began to assign blame to each other. Before the hearings, before the recall, before the public confrontation, the signs already existed. In the late 1990s, reports of failures began to emerge in hot climate regions: Arizona, Texas, Florida. Under high temperature conditions, the internal heat of the tire was more intense. Consumers reported tread separation at highway speeds. In some cases, the vehicle rolled over. Before the United States, similar complaints had emerged in other markets, including Saudi Arabia. The pattern existed, but it was not yet treated as a national crisis. Lawsuits began to be filed. Warranty data began to accumulate. Internal reports circulated between departments. The problem was not invisible, it was fragmented. Meanwhile, millions of vehicles remained in operation. The question was not only whether the tire could fail, it was how many times it had already failed before the pattern was publicly recognized. Tread separation was not a blowout. It was not an explosion. It was a structural process. A radial tire is built in layers: carcass, steel belts, bonding rubber, tread. These layers must remain bonded under heat and high rotation. Under certain conditions, internal heat increased. Lower tire pressure generates greater flexing of the structure. Greater flexing generates more heat. At highway speed, under elevated temperature, the adhesion between layers could begin to deteriorate. The tread would partially detach. The driver did not always notice immediately. Within seconds, The separation completed. The tire lost integrity. In vehicles with a higher center of gravity, such as sport utility vehicles of that era, the sudden loss of stability increased the risk of rollover. The technical issue was not simple. It was a combination of tire design, manufacturing process, usage conditions, and vehicle configuration. But from the moment the pattern became evident, the discussion ceased to be only about engineering. It became about shared responsibility. The tire was Firestone's. The vehicle was Ford's. And the consequence was seen on the roads. In the Ford Explorer Owner's Manual, the recommended tire pressure was 26 pounds per square inch. PSI means pounds per square inch. It is the unit used to measure the air pressure inside a tire. The lower the pressure, the greater the flexing of the tire structure as the vehicle moves. Greater flexing generates more heat. More heat increases stress between the internal layers of the tire. Firestone advocated higher pressures in various applications. Ford maintained the 26 pounds per square inch recommendation to improve ride, comfort, and vehicle stability. Once the accidents gained national attention, the debate became public. Was the pressure too low? Was the tire design adequate? Did the vehicle's center of gravity amplify the loss of control? Ford and Firestone began presenting different interpretations. Firestone suggested that the vehicle configuration contributed to rollovers. Ford pointed to manufacturing issues in certain tire batches. The conflict was no longer internal. It became public. Two industrial giants found themselves arguing in congressional hearings over who was responsible for the combination that resulted in fatal accidents. The number printed in the owner's manual ceased to be a technical detail. It became one of the central points of the investigation. And from that moment on, a partnership of nearly 100 years began to disintegrate at the same speed that treads detached on the highways. In August 2000, Firestone announced the recall of 6.5 million tires in the United States. It was one of the largest recalls in industry history at that time. But the recall did not end the conflict. It exposed it. Hearings were held in the United States Congress. Executives from Ford and Firestone appeared under oath. The discussion ceased to be technical. It became public. Internal documents were analyzed. Warranty data was questioned. Accident reports were examined. The tension between the companies intensified. In May 2001, Ford announced that it would replace millions of additional tires on vehicles outside the original recall. Shortly after, the historic partnership was terminated. A relationship that began in the early 20th century ended amid public accusations. The financial impact was in the billions. Ford estimated costs exceeding $3 billion related to recalls, lawsuits, and associated losses. Bridgestone, Firestone's parent company, recorded significant losses and global restructuring. But the impact was not only financial, it was reputational, it was structural. Trust in one of the oldest industrial partnerships in American history had been broken. The tire ceased to be just rubber. It became evidence. And the conflict between Ford and Firestone came to be studied as a landmark of shared responsibility in the automotive industry. The crisis did not end with the recall. It reached Congress. In November 2000, the United States passed new legislation directly influenced by the case. Its name was the TREAD Act, Transportation, Recall Enhancement, Accountability and Documentation Act. In simple terms, a law to strengthen recalls and transportation accountability. The law changed the way the automotive industry reports safety problems. It began to require that automakers and component manufacturers submit regular reports to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Warranty data, lawsuits, consumer complaints, information about accidents involving injuries or fatalities. Before the Tread Act, much of this data was not shared in a systematic way. The law also mandated the implementation of tire pressure monitoring systems in new vehicles. TPMS, Tire Pressure Monitoring System, a dashboard alert when tire pressure falls below the recommended level. A number printed in the owner's manual was now monitored electronically. The Ford Firestone case transformed isolated complaints into mandatory regulatory data. It transformed regional accidents into national reporting obligations, and it transformed an industrial crisis into federal legislation. From that moment on, the discussion about safety ceased to be purely reactive. It became legally monitored. The tire that disintegrated at highway speed left a legacy that was not made of rubber. It was made of regulation. The Ford and Firestone case was not just a tire recall. It was a collapse of trust between historic partners. For nearly 100 years, Ford and Firestone walked side by side. Families were close, businesses were interconnected. The partnership seemed structural, until the structure cracked. The tire was manufactured by one company. The vehicle was designed by another. The recommended pressure was defined by one. The tire construction by another. When the failures began, the question was not simple. Was it the tire? Was it the vehicle? Was it the pressure? Was it the climate? Was it the speed? Or was it the interaction of all these factors? In complex systems, risk rarely resides in a single component. It emerges from interaction. The Explorer had a higher center of gravity. The tire had a history of tread separation. Lower pressure increased sidewall flex. Heat amplified stress. In isolation, each factor may appear manageable. Combined, they become systemic. The case demonstrated that responsibility is not binary. It does not end at the tire factory. It does not end at the vehicle assembly line. It extends to design decisions, to market pressure, to communication between companies, to data monitoring, to response time. The recall was massive, but the impact was greater. A partnership of nearly a century was terminated. The industry learned that supplier and automaker do not operate in silos, they operate in ecosystems. And in industrial ecosystems, when one component fails, the entire brand pays the price. The tire that disintegrated at highway speed revealed something deeper. In high-complexity systems, responsibility is shared, and when it is not clearly defined before a crisis, it will be defined during the crisis. The Ford Firestone case was not just an episode of the 2000s. It was a permanent warning about industrial interdependence, about trust, about systemic risk. The archive remains open. Subscribe to this channel to follow the next documented case.